Okay, awesome. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. It really is a pleasure to be presenting to you guys. My name is Emily Scicluna. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands in which my research was conducted, and that is the lands of the Wurundjeri, Wadawurrung, Djabwurrung, Gulidjan, Jagudwurrung, Jiriwurrung, Guditjmara, and Baraba people. And I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Thanks so much for coming along to hear about the Dunnies. I conducted my PhD research at Trobe University. And as Adrian mentioned, I am now currently a research associate at the University of Melbourne. Still working on my beloved Dunnarts, but also other carnivorous marsupials. Okay, so I'm going to roll through my thesis today, a lot of which involves the Grassy, the Grassy networks of this state. So my thesis revolved around native mammal conservation using fat-tailed Dunnarts as a model species. And for my first chapter, I set out to find fat-tailed Dunnarts in the wild, which surprisingly revealed to me that this common species was not, in fact, as common as what I was led to believe and what most people, in fact, thought. My second and third chapters investigated the consequences of captive breeding, which is a common conservation tool. So when other means of threat abatement are not accessible, we use captive breeding to conserve our threatened species with hopes of then reintroducing them back to the wild. But captivity can cause morphological and behavioural changes that may affect conservation outcomes. And I investigated changes in both morphology and behaviour for this species. And reintroductions are another common conservation tool and usually follow on from captive breeding efforts. So this formed the final element of my thesis, which was looking at the factors that contribute to reintroduction success in the first ever reintroduction of this species back to an area within their former home range. So we'll start with my first data chapter, and that's the one that's the most meaty and the most relevant to the Grassy Plains network. And that was looking at the fat-tailed Dunnarts, the Victorian basalt grasslands. So this chapter has been published, so feel free to access it. It's very recently led to an increase in conservation status for the Victorian fat-tailed Dunnarts. So this story starts with the basalt grasslands, which are among, as we know, the most endangered ecosystems on the planet. We have less than 1% of their original extent remaining. And while feral cats and foxes are responsible for considerable population declines of our grassland fauna, we know that the overwhelming factor prompting the dramatic decline of our grassland species is simply the loss of suitable habitat. So our features of a basalt grassland include a native community of grasses characterised by those intertussock spaces that occur between them. These spaces are integral in allowing our grassland fauna to get out and find their food. Then we have our basalt rocks. We have heavily fertile soils which waterlog over winter months and form deep soil cracks during summer when they're dried out through the heat. So it's an incredibly dynamic and changing landscape. And this is a great diagram from Land of Sweeping Plains. I'm sure Adrian is familiar with it. It illustrates the pre-European and current grassland distribution across Victoria, New South Wales and the Australian Capital Territory. So it clearly shows the isolated remnant habitats we're now working with in purple, which are, they're sporadic, few and far between. They're quite isolated. So fat-tailed Dunnarts are a nocturnal species and they are widespread across Australia. They're renowned for being the only small ground-dwelling marsupial to persist in grassland ecosystems across Victoria. And importantly, they're renowned for being able to persist in agricultural landscapes. Fat-tailed Dunnarts are a member of the Dasyuridae family, which means they are carnivorous marsupials. So while some people mistake them for rodents, they absolutely are not. And they're more closely related to the quolls, the Tasmanian devils, and their extinct cousin, the thylacine or the Tasmanian tiger. So while some of the larger dasyurids eat carrion or catch small vertebrate prey items, our fat-tailed Dunnarts predominantly eat insects. I will say, though, that my favourite fact about this species is that they will nest share with invasive house mice over the winter months when it's cold, and then when it's summer, they no longer have a need for the snuggle buddies, they will in fact eat their bedfellows. So don't let their looks fool you. They are incredibly ferocious. So across Australia, there's two genetically distinguished, geographically isolated populations of our Dunnies. These aren't accepted as separate subspecies, but they are genetically distinct and they're separated by evolutionarily significant units. So my work has focused on the Fat-tailed Dunnarts south of the Murray River. Along with being genetically distinct, there is also morphological difference. I hope it shows up clearly on your screens, but those on the left are Dunnarts occurring more in arid environments across Australia, and they're more pale, browner fur with longer tails. And those on the right are from our basalt grassland, and they have much darker fur to match the basalt sort of soils, and a slightly shorter tails. And the reason for that, I'm not sure, but there does seem to be a difference. When I started this research, the conservation classifications for Fat-tailed Dunnarts looked at the entire species distribution across the country, which I quickly decided was a problem because the two genetically distinguished groups occupied vastly different habitats and therefore had vastly different threats. And no one was paying attention to the fact that they are, in fact, geographically isolated. They cannot swim across the Murray River. So these are two very separate populations. The Fat-tailed Dunnart was at the time classified as least concern internationally and near threatened in Victoria. However, it did not have any statutory listing. So the last major surveys for Fat-tailed Dunnarts were conducted by Steve Morton in 1972 through to 1976, and his Victorian sites were located at the Western Treatment Plant in Werribee, which is in Victoria, which processes most of Melbourne's sewage. However, it also happens to have fenced grasslands out there. And Morton recorded over 700 Fat-tailed Dunnart surveys, captures at these 4 sites after surveying monthly for 4 years. So although all of this land is still run by Melbourne Water, unfortunately, by the time I got there, I found that 2 of his main sites had been leased for agriculture and the landscape stripped of rocks for cropping. And another was cleared for the construction of grain silos. So it was basically just a big concrete slab, leaving only 1 site, which did happen to be Morton's primary survey site. So I used a similar survey protocol to Morton over the course of 12 months. However, I actually doubled his survey effort. So to increase my chances of finding this species, I also added terracotta roof tiles out there. So I added some artificial habitat, in total surveying 250 pre-existing rocks in the landscape and also 5 transects of roof tiles, each over 1 kilometre long. So there was 180 tiles as well. And so these are Morton's results showing the average amount of animals he caught per month across the 4 years of his study. So I set out with intentions of adding another line to this graph to show how this species abundance may have changed over time. Here are my results. In case you missed it, there they are. I did not find a single individual scat or nest of this species in 1 year of surveying the site, which at the time was readily documented as not only a thriving population, but as the largest population in Victoria. So while these results were from 2019, unfortunately, as of where we are in June 2023, there still have not been any other Fat-tailed Dunnart observations or records in this landscape. So unfortunately, my result still is current. So why the population decline? I use this site as a case study for a trend that's occurring across Victoria and likely other states. Without appropriate fire regimes or grazing and grassland landscapes, what we're seeing is complete ecosystem structural change. And the native grasslands are starting to look less like the left image and more like the right image, which is a big problem. So let's revisit our features of a basalt grassland and we'll go through them one by one. Intertussock spaces are the spaces between our native grassland tussocks, and these are an imperative part of the grassland ecosystem and allow our grassland species, not just the Dunnarts, but many other fauna as well, to get out and find their prey. With the influx of invasive weeds and grasses, for example, Flora, Chilean needlegrass, our serrated tussock, etc., we're seeing this invasive vegetation filling in these integral intertussock spaces and changing the structure of the grassland. When Morton conducted his surveys in the 70s, sheep were still grazing the landscape, and he recorded the grass being at 60 centimetres at its highest. However, when I go out there now, the grass is often taller than me, and that's the phalaris that's just taken over the place. Land burns on both public and private properties are happening less and less due to reduction in appropriate climatic windows. But when they do happen, they are great at eliminating those invasive weeds and keeping our natives going. So planned burns are integral for maintaining these grasslands. Grazing is usually described as a negative in the ecology space, but as far as maintaining grassland ecosystems, in the absence of fire, sheep grazing is actually pretty good at keeping down that invasive vegetation and somewhat sustaining intertussock spaces. So grazing is better, a better management tool in this space than no management at all. It's certainly not preferable, but it is better than nothing at all. And I will point out here that our native herbivores, so our kangaroos, etc., eat native vegetation. Our invasive herbivores are the ones that are going to attack some of that invasive vegetation. So it's almost a necessary evil here. And that leaves our basalt rocks and soil cracks. So Dunnarts don't dig tunnels straight into the earth. They dig under rocks or woody debris, or they utilize our soil cracks. So it's integral that these are maintained in Dunnart habitat. And this is a summary of what our average grazed landscape looks like. So we've got our basalt rocks, our soil cracks, we've got invasive vegetation, but sheep keeping that down and somewhat maintaining our intertussock spaces and our structural integrity of our grassland. And in turn, we've got Dunnarts persisting in this landscape. So now let's consider the other type of agricultural land use, and that is cropping. Cropping involves removal of the native plant species in addition to a whole range of land management practices that leaves absolutely no room for fat-tailed Dunnart habitat. Looking at Victoria specifically, 55% of our state is freehold agricultural land, which means the majority of appropriate land for Victorian fat-tailed Dunnarts is currently privately owned. So this species in this state is in the hands of private landowners. As global temperatures and levels of carbon dioxide are rising, in addition to more variable rainfall, our Victorian farmers are being forced to accommodate a changing climate. And while climate change is having many negative impacts for livestock farmers, these are grossly outweighed by positive impacts for our crop farmers. And Victoria is already seeing a dramatic increase in cropping and decrease in livestock agricultural practices across the state. So this means a lot more unsuitable land for our Dunnarts. Another problem is that farmers of livestock often actively invest in removing invasive predators, so our cats and our foxes, from the landscape because they pose an economic threat to their livelihood. Landholders who use the land for cropping, however, I fear would be less likely to see value, unless from a conservation perspective, in using their time and their money removing these invasive predators, as these feral species, they'd have less negative implications on their livelihood. And I raise this as a point because our Victorian farmers are some of, our greatest sort of army when it comes to removing some of these invasive predators in our ecosystems. So in summary, we have our basalt grasslands where our Dunnarts thrive. We've got our basalt grasslands featuring invasive vegetation, and then we have our agricultural land featuring livestock, which still allows our Dunnarts to be present. And then we have our agricultural crops, which is a landscape that doesn't leave room for fat-tailed Dunnarts at all. So I put all of this information together. I collected the evidence to show a dramatic population decline of fat-tailed Dunnarts at the very site that was considered to be Victoria's largest population of the species. And I pieced together why this may be happening. So unfortunately, I also looked at 40 other sites across Victoria that previously recorded fat-tailed Dunnarts in the past 10 years. And I found signs of Dunnarts at only 7 of those 40. So in 2020, I submitted documentation to nominate this species for increased conservation status in Victoria. In 2022, I finally gained scientific advisory committee support of my nomination on the grounds that I'd satisfied not 1 but 2 IUCN level criteria. So I actually filled this out to international standard to make sure it ticked all boxes. And one of the things I managed to prove was that we have had a reduction of 60% of population size of the fat-tailed Dunnarts in the past 20 years. I believe it could well be more than that, but I was limited by the data I had access to, which wasn't too much. I've recently been an expert reviewer on the Fat-tailed Dunnart action statement, and as of May, our Dunnarts have gained threatened species listing in Victoria. So that was an awesome win, not only for this species, but just to our grasslands, and it's raised some more awareness for this incredible ecosystem. And this has been attracting some media attention lately, which is really exciting for our basalt grasslands. And I will thank Adrian for his assistance with this. I did have a bit of a laugh. That newspaper article sort of top left, it says fierce furball needs a helping hand. And I was never, that was second page of the age. And I wasn't really sure if I was the fierce furball or if the Dunnarts were the fierce furball, but either way, I'm happy to take it. Okay, so for this chapter, my first conclusion is the importance of revisiting historic survey sites, because Western Treatment Plant was renowned for having a thriving population of fat-tailed Dunnarts. But just because they did 50 years ago doesn't mean that's the case right now. And if no one checks, we don't actually know. While they're not a separate subspecies, I definitely believe it's time to view the fat-tailed Dunnarts as two genetically distinct, geographically isolated populations with very different threats. So grasslands have suffered extensive habitat destruction, and I'm really concerned that, we could watch the last small mammal of our grassland ecosystems disappear before our eyes on the basis that we think they're still doing well in the more arid environments. And I say think because I haven't done that research yet, and nor has anyone else. So we'll see how the rest of the Dunnarts are going. I think this is a really good case study for a trend that's occurring across Victoria. Given in Victoria, the majority of fat-tailed Dunnarts are existing on privately owned land, which is predominantly agricultural land. We need to know what trends are occurring across our agricultural landscapes and what is the predicted land use changes across our grasslands for the future, because this will affect this species and many others. So my next chapter focused on the consequences of captive breeding on skull morphology and brain size. And we know that captivity leads to change. So hello, artificial selection, that can include changes in morphology. It's not hard to tell if you look at these dog skulls, which ones belong to an animal that's more likely to be successful in the wild. And hint, it's not the bulldog. My aim was to conduct brain size and morphological trait comparisons between captive bred and wild caught or museum specimen fat-tailed Dunnarts to identify the effects of captivity on these traits. So I wanted to look at differences between wild and captive individuals, males, females, and I wanted to track changes through captive bred generations. And I used 116 captive adult and 55 wild adult specimens I collected museum specimens from around the country and had them all sent to Melbourne. So massive thanks to Melbourne, Western Australian and South Australian museums. So here's a visual representation of what my results showed. And that is that captivity is resulting in wider, shorter snouts. So change is definitely occurring. And you may notice that I'm basically breeding bulldogs here. This is what I happened to notice, which was a little bit ironic. So this observation aligns with the literature. And I believe that this is due to not only my captive population reaching genetic bottleneck, but it's also likely due to captive individuals eating a softer diet than wild individuals. And this is really challenging with captive carnivores in particular, because ethics restricts us feeding an identical diet to what our carnivores would consume in the wild. We cannot exactly replicate what a wild carnivore would be eating in captivity, as we simply are not allowed to. The other interesting thing is I found that captive animals have significantly larger brains than their wild counterparts. And I'm a little bit suspicious about this, because when we compare our wolf to our English bulldog, I'm just not sure that we can be confident the bulldog has a bigger brain. I'm not sure. So looking at the literature, most species captive bred for some time record a decreased brain size, though there were a few examples where no change was recorded. And the only other marsupial model, which happened to be the stripe-faced Dunnart, is down there in the no change of brain size section. However, that was after 2 to 7 generations captive bred, and my animals were more like 60 generations. So they are a different sort of set of samples. At the time, my findings contrasted against every single other piece of literature I could find. And I sat on this finding for several years because I was so confused about it. But I got in contact with some Mexican wolf researchers in Texas who had strangely on the other side of the world discovered exactly the same trend in another captive carnivore. However, this is obviously a placental carnivore, and a wolf is not exactly comparable to a fat-tailed Dunnart. But as far as diet, perhaps it is. So we became collaborators, and we're looking more into that establishing geometric morphometric, having a look at this more with geometric morphometrics and using CT scanning analysis to look at 3D analysis of shapes. We can look into this a little bit more because I'm a bit suspicious about that brain size result. My next chapter compared captive and wild fat-tailed Dunnart behavioural comparisons and analyses as to whether captive breeding resulted in changes. So the concept of animal personalities and cognitive ability is not a new one, nor is developing methods to measure this. If you consider our domestic pets, for example, irrespective of breed, sex, age, etc., our cats and dogs, for example, clearly have consistent individual behaviours, otherwise known as personalities. And the ability for species to utilise resources in their environment is linked to personality and cognition. So evading predators, finding suitable habitat, finding food or suitable mates for reproduction, that's all part of cognitive ability, which is all part of personality. And there's many studies that look into behaviour change in captivity, as it's well known that this is a potentially adverse effect of breeding in captivity. So I used 5 behavioural tests to categorise personality and cognition on over 200 captive individuals, and around, I think it ended up being 16 wild individuals. I wanted to get more, however, COVID-19 happened, and so I ended up sitting at 16 wild individuals tested rather than more. The aim was to reintroduce the captive animals to a predator-proof wildlife sanctuary and to then track reintroduction success to establish links between behaviour and survival. So these were the tests I used. They were called open field test, novel object, predator avoidance or recognition, aggression, and Y maze. And these were the behaviours I looked at. So fast movement, slow movement, jumping, grooming, stereotypic behaviours, engagements with novel objects or predator sense, aggression, etc. And there's a lot of information on this slide, but I just want to show that there was a lot that went into this. The problem with analysing animal behaviour is that various behaviours could indicate totally different things. So for example, if you see an animal jumping on the spot, this may be a totally normal part of that animal's daily activity budget. I don't know if Dunnarts just like to jump on the spot in their time. It may also be that this animal is trying to show escape behavior, so it's trying to get out of whatever situation it's in. It also could be totally calm, but just exhibiting exploratory behavior and having a look around its surroundings. So interpretation of results in the behavioral ecology sphere needs to be approached with caution, and behavioral data needs to be interpreted as a whole, not just the presence of a single or a presence or absence of a single behavior. So I began with open field testing to look at an individual's behaviour following placement in an open and novel environment. The animals placed in the arena and allowed to freely move around for 10 minutes while being recorded by an overhead camera. And in this test, some animals would cower in the corner and would not move for the whole 10 minutes, while some would roam around calmly exploring their new surroundings. So there was an obvious difference going on. I then presented this animal with a novel object. And in this case, it was an upside down porcelain bowl for 10 minutes. So this isn't overly scary, but it is a novel object to the Dunnart. So it doesn't actually know if that bowl poses a threat. And so that's why we're measuring that behavior. So it's measuring an individual's risk-taking phenotype. And in this test, again, some Dunnarts would do everything they could to get away from this scary new object. However, some Dunnarts ran straight up and stood on top of the bowl to get a better look of the situation they were dealing with. So again, we have different behaviours. The animal was then presented with a choice of 3 shelter sites for the night. So one shelter site was unscented, one shelter site contained the scent of a known predator, so fox urine, and one shelter site contained horse urine as a procedural control. And the aim of this was to interpret whether or not captivity had an effect on predator avoidance or recognition. And the answer is no, not really, because none of them recognized a fox as a threat. So unfortunately, I pretty much had the same kind of behavioral traits. I would really like to replicate this with perhaps some native snake skin, or perhaps some dingo scat or something else. Quolls would be awesome, but yeah, something else to see where their predator avoidance is at. So aggression tests showed the most obvious differences of all, and that is because some Dunnarts would not hesitate to latch onto my finger and try to eat me at any given opportunity. However, others would just sit calmly and wouldn't appear to have any stress at all or any bother with being held. So that was pretty obvious. And my last test was the Y maze, which looked at short-term spatial memory and learning. So the testing occurs in a Y-shaped arena, and the aim is to try and teach the animal to run to the coloured pattern on the back wall and associate that with a food reward. So I thought this would be really interesting, but there didn't end up being any significant results. So again, I wouldn't mind trying this with a different protocol, but this didn't end up amounting to anything. Overall, my wild Dunnarts showed low aggression, but high instances of escape and risk aversion behaviour, while captives were much more aggressive towards the handler, but showed decreased risk aversion and increased grooming and circling, which are both examples of stereotypic behaviours. Stereotypic behaviours show the exhibition of stress in the form of an unhelpful behaviour rather than a useful behaviour like escaping. Risk aversion was shown through interference with a novel object, so our porcelain bowl, the predator scent, so fox urine, and our wild Dunnarts, on the whole, avoided these potentially dangerous situations more than the captives, which were more likely to engage in these unknown, potentially dangerous situations. So what this showed was that captivity had definitely had an effect on these individuals, and that's likely to affect reintroduction outcomes of these animals if they were released. And that leads me to my final chapter, which looked at how these factors may influence reintroduction success over time. However, another much larger chapter ended up stemming from the challenges associated with this reintroduction. And that took the form of a coronial inquest, or a reintroduction post-mortem, if you will, to identify who in fact killed most of my Dunnarts. So similar to my first chapter where I set out to find Dunnarts, this chapter led to an unexpected outcome that dramatically influences land management. So this one's, I think you'll find quite interesting. So I'll start by saying that a lot went wrong with this part of my project as it coincided with the end of the world. And it was the start of a really devastating few years. So yeah, the date of the Trobe University shutdown was from midnight, the 24th of March, 2020. So I finished releasing animals a few hours prior to this, and we went into state lockdown at midnight. So literally, I was releasing animals up until we went into state lockdown. To say this put pressure on the project is an absolute understatement, and this was an incredibly mentally challenging time. So my release of the animals at Nangak Tamboree, or formerly the Latrobe Wildlife Sanctuary, occurred on the 23rd and 24th of March. This is a site protected by cat and fox exclusion fences. I've deliberately drawn attention to the use of the term predator-proof fence here because I will show later that I think the narrative around that term needs to change a little bit. 180 animals were released to this 30-hectare cat and fox-proof site into 10 natural habitat enclosures of around 15 by 15 metres. So my Dunnart-proof fences were erected within macropod-proof fences to avoid the jumpers jumping on my smaller fences, and then these were within the fox and cat-proof fences. So it was fences within fences within fences to try and protect these guys. The aim of this reintroduction was to track reintroduction success and link all of this with my behavioural data. I basically wanted to find out which Dunnarts lived and try to identify why based on their personalities. And that's not only relevant to the fat-tailed Dunnarts, which by this time I've identified are a threatened species in themselves, but also all of their relative dasyurids that are of conservation concern. So this species is notoriously difficult to capture. In fact, it's in some studies has a recorded capture rate of 0.01%. So don't worry about finding needles in haystacks, try finding a Dunnart in a grassland. Not only are they challenging to find because they are a 15-gram nocturnal fluff ball that refuses to enter traps and perfectly camouflages with the grass around them, but I've since shown they are in fact threatened, which means there's not as many of them out there as what we first thought. So a difficulty of measuring reintroduction success is not being able to track the animals once they're released. And the fat-tailed Dunnart is so small, you can't collar them for radio tracking as you would with some other small mammals or birds or even reptiles and whatnot, actually. So introducing the wild track networking system, the animals were microchipped prior to release. The aim was for when the animal to wander past a sensor, it would be automatically data logged and the information would be sent to a computer, completely eliminating the need to track each animal individually. So it was a bit of a, this was going to be a game changer. So this is a rough idea of how my wild track sensors were placed around the enclosures. However, unfortunately, due to COVID-19 delays, this technology came in 10 months after my release. So it was over 12 months late. It was 10 months after the Dunnarts had been released, which meant that I really missed the crucial tracking period during that sort of month after I let these guys go. But of course, I really wanted to make sure I increased my chances of finding these animals. So I added 3 cameras into each of the 10 enclosures. I installed pitfall lines of 5 buckets and drift fences between them as a physical capture method. Although barely anyone has ever had success trapping fat-tailed Dunnarts using Elliott traps, I thought, why not? I'll give it a go and I'll put 25 in 5 sites as well. So I had those out there. And then I figured, okay, well, maybe I'll put tile grids out there as well, just in case. As you could probably tell, I was pretty desperate to be able to find these animals because then I would get that reintroduction success data. And then, so I utilized every single survey method that I had accessible, just in case one had more luck than the others. So this is a summary of the survey effort that I put in to try and find my animals during 2020 to try and measure reintroduction success. I'm pretty proud of this effort, especially considering most of this effort was done single-handedly by myself during our 262 days of Melbourne lockdowns. So you can imagine it being utterly devastating for me to not find a single Dunnart during all of this effort. So I didn't find evidence of a single live animal in any camera, Elliott, pitfall, tile, surveying efforts for a year post-release. And I also did not find any nests or scats, so there were no signs of them. However, the seemingly impossible thing happened, and 10 months after my release, the sensors went out and they successfully detected 4 individual Dunnart IDs. So I had both males and females. And by this time, my introduction success became N equals 4 out of N equals 180, but those animals had survived over a year out there. So that begged the question whether or not there were more and they simply weren't being picked up by my sensors. Because by this time, I'd already pulled up all of my fences, so these animals could now move throughout the sanctuary. And then something more extraordinary happened, and that is that 2 years past my reintroduction, a wildlife sanctuary staff member sat on a log and a juvenile fat-tailed Dunnart ran out from underneath it, stared him in the eyes and then vanished. So this was not only a sign that these animals had lived long enough to breed, but there was recruitment in the ecosystem because a living juvenile had been sighted that had weaned from its mother. So there has to be animals existing in this landscape. So of the 4 survivors that I had IDs for, I was able to do randomizations to determine whether the mean traits of these survivors differed significantly from the others. And I actually managed to find that my surviving 4 Dunnarts exhibited significantly more fast movement, less slow movements than expected, and they also spent more time trying to escape in some of those tests that I did earlier. They were also more aggressive than expected, okay? So in conclusion, my 4 surviving Dunnarts were in fact ninjas. And this is a really important outcome because it means that in the future, we can identify captive bred animals with increased chance of survival and release those animals, which increases our conservation outcomes. Okay, so in addition to my 4 survivors and my 1 recruited juvenile Dunnart, there were the remains of 30 deceased Dunnarts that I was able to collect and later analyze these for behavioural clues as to how they died. And this is where the coronial inquest part of it came into play. So my co-supervisor, Marissa Parrott from Zoos Vic, helped me to assess the bite wounds and perform autopsies on these individuals to determine cause of death. And I had some help from Erin Hill, who helped me with collecting genetic samples from these animals and performed some next generation genetic wizardry to get further evidence of cause of death. So black rats were implicated in the deaths of 18 Dunnarts. 16 individuals had very obvious black rat incisor bite marks causing broken skull and punctured brain. Genetic evidence later linked this to black rat also. So not only was there behavioural evidence and quite clear bite marks, it was then later backed up by DNA evidence. There are another 2 Dunnarts that were highly likely killed by black rats. However, we cannot be certain because those animals were out in the landscape too long as far as the deceased individuals. So DNA was no longer able to be picked up on those, specimens. If you look at the size of a European black rat skull there compared to fat-tailed Dunnarts, the incisors alone are clearly high enough to penetrate straight through the skull cavity of a fat-tailed Dunnart. So, and that is what happened. The reality is for a lot of my animals, unfortunately, this reintroduction was highly likely over in one night. And looking back at the quantity of black rats in the sanctuary and the bite wounds of my animals, if they had any interaction with this species, they didn't stand a chance. There were 2 animals that I watched, a magpie and grey butcherbird, attack and carry away in front of me upon release, which was awful, but obviously a definite cause of death. And there were 7 individuals that had very tiny puncture wounds, no more than a couple millimeters on the outside of their bodies. But these punctures were so substantial that they had penetrated the body cavities and had caused immense internal bleeding. So that was confidently cause of death. Now, I cannot be sure what caused these puncture marks. However, notably, these deceased Dunnarts were found freshly deceased out in the open. They were still warm, okay? So they weren't cached under logs in piles like a lot of the others that were killed by black rats were. They were out in the open, still warm, and there was about 30 noisy miners making an absolute deafening mobbing call. They were going nuts when I arrived there. So there's plenty of examples of noisy miners mobbing anything and everything that enters their territory. However, this is not often recorded in small mammals, and that is because there's a temporal separation. So our noisy miners are diurnal and most of our small mammals are in fact nocturnal, and our Dunnarts are supposed to be. However, we're dealing with animals that have been captive bred, and unfortunately I'm confident that these Dunnarts have strayed out into the open and may have succumbed to noisy miner mobbing behaviour. And unfortunately, we didn't get any genetic data to back this theory up because a noisy miner beak it's highly unlikely to leave DNA, as we need saliva for DNA, and the outside of a beak is unlikely to have saliva on it. So I'm not sure. The jury's still out, but I have my suspicions as to what happened here. And the cause of death for a further 3 of these individuals was entirely unknown, as by the time I located them, they were well and truly too decomposed or consumed or whatnot. So unfortunately, this is not a new story, and my fat-tailed Dunnart reintroduction will join a long line of unsuccessful reintroduction or conservation projects due to black rat predation pressure. So all the species shown here, as well as many, many, many more, are threatened, endangered, or even extinct due solely or in part to black rats. So there are some species on this screen that are now extinct solely because of black rats, which I think is just incredible, not in a good way. So for a conclusive list of the project outcomes and lessons, firstly, I documented a substantial decline of this species we thought was pretty common, and then I pursued updated conservation status. So as of May 2023, our fat-tailed Dunnarts are now in Victoria, have statutory listing, and they're classed as a threatened species. I successfully identified effects of captivity on skull morphology, brain size, behaviour and cognition in this species, which contributes to what we know about the impacts of captive breeding and how many or how that may impact their survival. And I managed to link behaviour to reintroduction success, even if only a mere 4 individuals. And this is exciting because if we can in future release animals that we know have increased chance of survival, then this is a real implication for future releases of captive bred individuals, not only fat-tailed Dunnarts, but similar species. I conducted the first reintroduction of fat-tailed Dunnarts back to a site within their former home range. And I know that I had 4 Dunnarts survive over a year out there past reintroduction. I know there was at least 1 offspring recruited, which is obviously the offspring of ninjas. So it must be doing all right out there because it has to be a ninja also, right? So considering Dunnarts have litters of up to 10, this begs the question of whether or not there are in fact more out there. And if so, how many? Are there enough out there and can they survive long term? I'm not sure. I certainly hope so. And I can tell people that future releases with black rats are not an option for our small mammals. So black and brown rats are one of the most devastating invasive species globally. However, this is, that we know of, the first recorded reintroduction of a small mammal that has been devastated by black rats. A really important take-home message is that I believe we need to change the narrative and we need to stop describing fox and cat-proof fences as predator-proof. Because if those fences are still permeable to black and brown rats, then they are not predator-proof. They are allowing some predators in. They are just fox and cat-proof. And that may not be relevant for all species, but it will be for some that are within those fences. The devastating effects of black and brown rats globally, including threats to Australian biodiversity, cannot be understated. And considering we're conducting more and more releases into these fenced cat and proof free reserves, I think this is really important to be aware of because I've already observed the same trends occurring at other properties across Victoria where foxes and cats have been removed, and this has led to a massive increase of rats, and the Dunnarts have since become absent and undetectable. So this isn't just one example, there is more, and we really need to consider future reintroductions of small mammals and consider this. My absolute overall hope for my PhD was that these learnings could be used to help not only the fat-tailed Dunnies, but all of their fellow endangered Dunnies. So yeah, I'm certainly, oh, something's happened here. Oh, I've been kicked off.
We can see you and hear you,
yeah.
Just not the screen share.
Yeah, just go back. Someone's done something.
Whoops. Can you see it now?
Indeed.
Brilliant.
Yes.
Okay. So to wrap things up, what can you guys do to help? Number 1 is to conserve our incredible remnant grasslands. That's the main thing we need to do. We need to leave rocks and logs in the landscape. We need to educate ourselves and others on how to tell the differences between native and invasive flora and fauna, because a lot of people don't know what a fat-tailed Dunnart is and wouldn't be able to tell it from a house mouse. So just knowing what the differences are and the fact that they exist is pretty important. We need to conserve our invertebrates. They're really important food items for so many of our small mammals. We need to remove invasive black and brown rats. We need to remove cats and foxes and invasive vegetation from these landscapes. I'm sure none of these things are new concepts, but just reiterating, this is absolutely the things that you can do to help. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you to all the people and organisations who have supported me, but most of all, thank you to the Dunnies. They may be small and unsuspecting, but they are relentlessly fierce. And when I grow up, I want to be just like them. Thank you so much. Now you can kick me off.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Emily. That was riveting, absolutely fascinating.
Amazing.
I wondered, does anyone have a question for Emily? We've got perhaps 8 minutes or so for questions, so let's get a move on.
How long do they live for, Emily?
Great question. In the wild, our males will rarely get to 2 years. It's not a dramatic die-off like we see at the end of the breeding season in our Anticlinus or Northern Quoll or Phascogale or another one, but our male fat-tailed Dunnarts will rarely make it to a second breeding season. Our females will usually live 2 or 3 years in the wild. However, in captivity, I have got animals to almost 5 years. So it's that case of in captivity when they're living in hotel luxury, they can live a lot longer. So yeah.
Thank you.
No worries. I'm just checking. I'm checking
Yes,
all of these. Oh, you wrote what is the average lifespan? Thank you for your question.
Julie Cameron's got a question. How can we identify a Dunnart house hole under rocks?
How can you, the hole under a rock, did you say?
Yeah. How can you tell a Dunnart home?
Oh, the best way to tell is the fact that they are filthy. They are filthy little buggers and they will poo everywhere. So they leave, scent marking is incredibly important to most Azurids, in fact, but they will urinate and defecate all through their little space. So the telltale sign when you flip a tile, for example, is there's usually Dunnart poo everywhere, and it's very obviously different to house mouse poo. If you have a little Google, you might be able to see, or have a look at it's Barbara Trigg's track scats and other traces. You know, compare the fecal pellets is the best way to tell. But as for the hole, I mean, it's hard to tell because Dunnarts will take over a mouse hole anyway. So that, you know, they it's hard to tell which one they might be.
Fantastic. I was wondering, Emily, when you look back at the impact of black rats and then you think about, can you compare that to the impact of cropping or the predation by foxes or cats or whatever? Do you think one is having a bigger impact than the other?
It's an awesome question. I'm not confident. I'm not confident to answer it. You know, I'm not confident which one would be causing the greatest threat. But I know that some of my Dunnarts managed to outcompete in some way the black rats that absolutely decimated a lot of them. And that means that they had some kind of anti-predatory behaviour. Probably they'd have a sniff of something that wasn't quite right and they'd be out of there before they got the opportunity to meet a black rat. Because if they did come to face, I just don't see how they would ever survive, frankly. So I think it's that aversion and avoiding risk, you know, whereas cropping, I mean, there's just no habitat left at all. So there's just no space for them. So yeah, I don't think it's a good news story for cropping landscapes, unless what I've been trying to say to local sort of community and farming groups is that, because I totally understand, right? Our farmers are under pressure. They're obviously going to have to make decisions for their families and whatnot. It's what happens. If they are going to be cropping landscapes, to leave just a section, leave the rocks there, or put all the rocks over there, or, you know, leave the roadside reserves untouched so that these animals have some kind of chance of persisting, because they simply cannot persist in a cropped landscape.
Julie Cameron asks if cameras are worthwhile to identify Dunnarts in the landscape.
Yeah, they're a great tool. They're just challenging because a Dunnart is tiny and the landscape is huge. And so you're relying on that tiny animal crossing in front of the camera, which is simply, it's challenging, it's hard, but if you do it, awesome, you know, it's a bit of luck though, is the problem.
I want to ask all the dry stone walls. I sort of have some recollections that some of the consultants have found them in dry stone walls, and we have a lot of them across the landscape, especially in the Western Plains. Absolutely. Are they helping? Are they doing something? Is that where they're living?
So those dry stone walls that you're talking about, and you're right, they're iconic in some of those Western grassland farming communities. Those rocks used to be in the landscape, so they used to be the rocks that the Dunnarts were hiding under. And so those rocks have been moved and then used to form these, you know, quite impressive, you know, fences. And so then that is what you're right. fat-tailed Dunnarts and skinks and whatnot, they can persist under those stone walls. However, they're relying on a fence that's, you know, literally 30 or 40 centimeters wide. And that's kind of that they're not going to live in between the rocks. They're only going to be living under that bottom, you know, level. So that's where people would be finding them. It's simply because they haven't got anywhere else to go. So, and I also, you know, it's hard because I wouldn't recommend, you know, I did a lot of rock flipping in that paper, but I wouldn't recommend going out and flipping rocks in landscapes, because we know that underneath our rocks are these incredible little ecosystems with microclimates, and there's so many threatened species that rely on those rocks sitting exactly where they are, and they cannot be disturbed. So yeah, you know, it's really hard, Debbie, like really hard.
Did you find them under the tiles? Was that a good way to find them or not?
At other sites, I have successfully found them under tiles so at 7 sites, I've successfully found Dunnarts under tiles. So yes, you can definitely find them. I've found individuals, and I've found the telltale sign is the scats and the nests. So I'll often kick house mice out of their little nests. And if you know what a house mouse nest looks like, it's like a beautiful little bird nest, you know, a really clean sort of cup of grass, really neat. A Dunnart is nothing like that. It's quite pathetic. In fact, it's just a few little straggles of grass. But what you can do is pick up the house mouse nest. And if there's a layer of moldy poop underneath, then you know a Dunnart's been there. So, you know, there's telltale signs, and tiles are brilliant. I'm really hoping, I've applied for some funding, but I'm really hoping to be putting tile grids out across Victoria later this year and next year. So if anyone has properties where they think Dunnarts may be or used to be and would like to have me put some tiles out there, I would love to hear from you.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Emily. I think we're at 7:30 now, so we better...
That's a question, I think.
Oh,
a few questions.
There are a lot of questions still going in the chat, but I'm just concerned that we need to move on to our Grassy Plains meeting before too long. Perhaps while we're having a toilet break, Emily can hit the chat line and sort some of those things out if she's still got some time.
Sure.
Thank you so much, then.
Fantastic.
Emily, that
Thank
was
you.
a very enlightening and thoroughly entertaining and interesting thing. And now, yes, indeed, chat, indeed.
Thank you so much for joining me and having me.
All of the above.
Yeah.
So perhaps we'll just take 5 minutes now to have a quick break or whatever, and we'll rejoin at about 7:35. So and get on with our Grassy Plains Network meeting. Thank you very much.
For those that are still hanging about, I'm more than happy to answer questions, or I was thinking I might go through and answer the questions in the chat, and then I'll head off before the meeting. So if anyone wants to verbally ask any more questions, feel free.
Yes, Emily, that's fantastically interesting research. I was wondering if the Dunnarts are likely to predate on grassland earless dragons.
Oh, interesting question. I think it's possible, but not highly likely. I think in a lot of, so Steve Morton, who did all of the 1970s early survey work, also did a lot of prey identification. So he did a lot of DNA work looking at fat-tailed Dunnart fecal samples, and he only recorded the presence of skinks or house mice, so just any vertebrates, and it was something like less than 1% of fecal samples, which means that they're mainly living off beetles, crickets, centipedes. Wolf spiders are a massive one. They absolutely love them. You know, yeah, more the arthropods and the invertebrates rather than the lizards. It is a possibility, but I don't think they would be a major prey item.
All right, great. Thank you. Really
No
good
worries. Thank you,
research.
Simon.
Do they have a really small home range, or how far would they go?
So the largest range that they've been recorded moving in one, oh no, it wasn't in one night. Steve Morton again recorded some animals 500 meters apart, so they definitely will move that far. However, recently, a fat-tailed Dunnart captive colony that I know of, they gave them running wheels to run on, or they already had the running wheels, but they videoed how fast and how long they were using the running wheels for. And they recorded a fat-tailed Dunnart running over 25 kilometers in one night. So that, to me, for me, that's an example of a stereotypic behavior. That animal is quite stressed and it's trying to just exert extra energy, or perhaps it may not even be stressed, but it's just not stimulated, so it's exerting that energy. However, it does show the physical capacity of that animal, right? And that's a captive animal that wouldn't be overly fit, you know, because they haven't been out hunting their own food in the grasslands. And considering the home ranges of so many of our other small Dunnarts, our Julia Creek Dunnart, our Sandhill Dunnarts, our Kangaroo Island Dunnarts, they all have some of them have massive home ranges of, you know, of 30 odd sort of, what are some of the ones I've read? Yeah, 30 kilometers or even into the hundreds of kilometers. So it wouldn't surprise me if the fat-tailed Dunnarts are much wider. We just don't quite know.
Just wondering, do they store fat in their tails or something like that? Is that why their tails are fat?
They do. Sorry for not mentioning that. That's the best fact of all. They do, in fact, store fat in their tail, much like a camel's hump. So it's an energy reserve. And a fat-tailed Dunnart is a happy Dunnart, but they will, you know, you'll often find, you can find them with quite thin tails, and it means there's maybe less invertebrates in the ecosystem, or perhaps it's a more stressed individual.
Yeah. What is
That'd make
the
sense
title
with
of-
the two
what-
genetic. Sorry.
What
That
is
would
the-
make sense with the two genetic types, wouldn't it? Because there's more available food, you'd think, in the Victorian ecosystems. Yeah. So
I
it
would
makes
think
sense
so.
that the
Deserts are
tails
hard work to live
shorter.
in.
They wouldn't need to. Yeah.
Sorry, Alan.
Sorry.
What is the title and location of this paper?
Sure, I'll put that in the chat for you if you like.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep. In fact, I wonder if I can upload a. Oh, I can upload a file. I'm going to go ahead and just add the PDF for you, and you can download it, because I don't want you to have to be paying any pesky fees to access my research. I'd much rather just give it to people. So I can put it in there if that suits you.
Thank you.
Yes, no worries.
Emily,
Yes.
have you done any work or researched what's been done in the Anglesey heathlands?
No, I
No?
haven't. I think that,
Okay.
would that be more, I think that would be more white-footed Dunnart territory than
Oh, it might be.
I
Can't remember what I caught something on camera down there. I was looking for New Holland mice,
Oh, cool.
but we did get some Dunnarts, but just on
Okay.
camera.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Well, I'd love to see
you
the
probably
photos.
don't.
I could ID them for you.
All right. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly happy.
I'll look them up.
I can put my email in the chat. Yeah.
Yeah.
Always happy to
Cool.
receive random small mammal photos. I will
Yes.
never complain.
Great. Okay. I'll do that.
No worries.
Thank you, Emily, for holding the fort there in the break again. You're just too interesting and entertaining. Normally we let these talks go on for longer. It's so I'm feeling very apologetic, because it's just we have to talk about the future of the Grassy Plains Network tonight. So it's because our ownership structure, our governance structure is about to change. So it's an
incredibly important conversation. So please don't apologize. And yeah, just feel free. I'll put my email in the chat. Anyone can email me any more questions, but I'll go through and answer some questions in written format as well while you continue your meeting, Adrian. No worries. Thank you for having me.
thank you for having us. Indeed.
Thank you. Wonderful talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.